Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Marty Rosenberg, and I'm Content Director of the Energy Times. Before we begin, a few words about this webinar technology. This platform allows our audience to be more involved with the presentation and, more importantly, allows you to watch this event the way you want to. To begin with, feel free to customize your webcast console. You may move windows around by dragging on the title bar or resize your windows by clicking on the lower right-hand corner of any window. On your console, the Black & Veatch logo is hot-linked. If you want to visit their website during the webcast, click on the logo and a new window will open, and it will not take you out of the webinar. You will also notice a toolbar at the bottom of your console. These buttons allow you to open and close widgets on your screen. You can ask questions during the presentation. Type it into the Q&A box and click Submit. We will promise to endeavor to answer as many as possible at the conclusion of today's session. And by the way, we invite you to get social. If at any time during our session you hear something interesting, feel free to tweet it to your followers using the Twitter widget. We appreciate your feedback, so please click on the red survey icon and complete the form. If at any time you experience difficulties with the audio or slides, simply press F5 key and refresh your webinar console. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. David Mayer is the Senior Managing Director of Black & Veatch and leads the company's Security, Risk, and Resilience team. He has more than 25 years of management consulting experience, including 12 in the banking industry and 14 in the energy industry. His experience in the banking industry is increasingly relevant to today's power industry. Today's power leaders are facing increased regulatory requirements, just as the banking industry did two decades back. Today he's working with utility leaders to develop and implement cultures of risk that enable them to effectively comply with current regulations, anticipate future regulations, and proactively identify and mitigate cyber and physical vulnerabilities. David Price is the Associate Vice President at Black & Veatch, and he joins us as well today. He's an accomplished leader with over 25 years of management, strategy, product development, delivery, and operational experience in the utility arena, as well as systems integration and software. In his current position, he leads Black & Veatch's asset management practice to develop and deliver comprehensive solutions to clients in power, water, oil, and gas industries that align people, processes, technologies, and data to drive efficiency and reduce system risk. He is an expert in creation and delivery of large-scale complex business solutions and utility business process-based products, with particular emphasis on transmission and distribution and customer service applications. He has led major business process outsourcing contracts involving the design, development, and commissioning of highly complex business transaction hubs for multi-state energy commerce. Our topic today is justifying utility security investments. Over the years, it's been noted that the cost of outages, usually stemming from conventional sources such as storms and system malfunction, so have a huge toll on our economy. Some estimates of as little as $30 billion up to upwards of $130 billion a year. Now, we all have noted in recent months allegations of Russian hacking of our election system and possible interference that's being investigated to this day. Years ago, there have been front-page articles on the Wall Street Journal reporting that China and others have infiltrated our electric grid and potentially have disruptive agents embedded in our grid. This is a source of huge concern to utilities and policymakers around the country. And as a result, estimates show that spending on grid security is going to grow rapidly, reaching as much as $7.2 billion by 2020, according to some industry estimates. So the conversation today is extremely timely, playing off of news concerns about cybersecurity, as I suggested, on a variety of fronts, and long-time anxiety going back years now of just how secure our grid is. With that, I'm very pleased today to have two experts from Black & Veatch to help explore how sizable investments in this area can be made. And as I've heard many state regulators say, the quandary they're in is how do you justify massive expenditures for items that hopefully will never have to be used. So we're going to get into that all, and I now turn it over to David Mayers. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Marty, and thank you so much, and thank you to everyone in the audience for being here. You know, I find the best part of my job at Black & Veatch is having the opportunity to talk to lots of different utility companies and learning new and innovative ideas from my customers. Today, I'm here to relay one of those learnings to you. The topic is focused on the challenge of justifying security investment. And based on some of the things Marty just mentioned, I think we all recognize the compelling urgency behind securing our critical infrastructure. You know, my sense is most folks in security-centric roles recognize the needs, yet we all find it challenging to justify the required investment for security to our senior executive teams in a meaningful way. And today we're going to explore and talk about, you know, why justifying security investment is so challenging and ways that suggested ways to approach that challenge. It was a privilege to recently work closely with an electric utility in the Northeast to help them define their requirements for physical security. I walked away from that engagement realizing I was seeing one of the better examples for how to make a strong business case for security, and I'm pleased to convey some of those details with you. For privacy purposes, I can't name the utility. Understandably, many utilities keep details on security close to the vest, but I can convey the approach that was taken, and my hope is you will find that approach both informative and valuable. The outcome of the initiative with this utility was a very sizable investment, exceeding $300 million in securing critical infrastructure. Investments on those types of scales only occur when there is a strong business justification. I'm also pleased today to be joined by my colleague, David Price. David runs our asset management consulting practice at Black & Veatch. David and I realize that in many ways we're both trying to solve the same problem when it comes to justifying investing in critical infrastructure, the only difference being we have different reasons for doing it. David and his team work to solve the challenge of aging infrastructure, among others, and have already developed leading-edge thinking on justifying investments in infrastructure. This same type of thinking can be leveraged in the security world, and David's going to be highlighting some of those ideas as we proceed through the conversation. So welcome, David. I don't know if there's maybe a few words of introduction you'd like to make.
Thanks, Dave, and welcome, everyone. I'd like to add to Dave's welcome for this presentation. I'm looking forward to providing some extra input into this incredibly important topic and hopefully help people leave with a clear idea on concrete ways they can take this whole issue forward, perhaps using some of the roads already traveled by some of the colleagues out there who perhaps don't necessarily directly work on security, but nonetheless have been dealing with similar issues around identifying risk and turning that into dollars and creating concrete plans. So thanks for having me, Dave. I look forward to talking with you.
Excellent. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a survey that Black & Veatch conducts on an annual basis. We survey the top utility industry leaders, and you know, for the last 10 years, this survey has been remarkably consistent, and that the industry views the top issue as reliability. The other issue that we've consistently seen recently is aging infrastructure, and probably the most interesting aspect is if you go back 10 years and look at this survey, cybersecurity wasn't even on the map. and now it's tied with aging infrastructure from an issue standpoint. The other sort of interesting takeaway is these are the top issues, but from a capital priority standpoint, we're not seeing security surface as a top investment priority. Existing asset maintenance is the top investment priority, which is really a priority tied to aging infrastructure. One of the challenges, I think this really highlights the reason we're talking today. We recognize that security is a challenge. How do we convince and convey the need for investment in solving that challenge? And I think one of the themes that we want to talk about today is the fact that we've really already started to solve the challenge by solving the aging infrastructure problem. And David, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you and your team have been working on that problem and some of the issues there.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I think the irony is if you look at any of these issues and plot them on some sort of continuum over time, the only difference is that aging infrastructure has sort of taken physical manifestation. I mean, if you look at some of the tragedies that have occurred in the gas industry, along with the increasing problems certain utilities around the country have had in their distribution systems, the point of the fact is that there have been sufficient actual physical events and subsequent consequences that's raised this to the front of the queue, and equally then people have now sought specific ways of being able to justify and target the investment. So I think the challenge is not just that people recognize there's a problem, because the problem's so great, the challenge then becomes how do you come up with a specific, targeted and quantifiable way of saying this is the type of investment needed in this type of area, and this is sort of the level of investment and the reduction in risk that you can expect to see. And I guess the point would be many organizations around the country now are actively doing that type of thing on the physical asset management side, and the opportunity exists for our security brethren to join that journey and perhaps leapfrog or bypass some of the previous sort of difficulties that these programs have had in getting underway. Back to you, Dave.
All right, thanks, Dave. So why is it so hard to justify security investments? I think it comes down to when you talk about investments in security, you're not talking about growing revenue, you're not talking about cost reduction. What you're really talking about is investing in reducing risk, and that's it's a more nebulous concept that I think we collectively struggle to articulate to our senior executive teams that help justify the reasoning for investing in security. So, how do you demonstrate risk reduction? I think, the key is, like everything, it's understanding and measuring your current levels of risk. You have to be able to measure it, you have to set targets, and you have to have a system for ongoing measurement so that you understand how those risk levels are changing over time. That's easy to say. It's not a trivial activity. And I think that there are examples of companies that do it well. There are examples of companies that have a risk-based culture. I come from a background of banking, and banking has had a risk culture for many years. We're starting to see the same sort of risk culture embed in the utility industry. Things like chief risk officers, for example, in a utility organization that didn't exist 10 years ago are now in place. So, it's all about talking in terms of risk as opposed to talking about ROI, and that's a real mental shift that's difficult to make. The other thing about security is it really spans across the breadth of the organization. So you're talking about operations, IT, finance. There's very few clear lines of sight for how you budget for security. So, how do you tip the scale and make the case? Companies that have a risk-based culture typically have something called a risk register, which is identifying at the very top level of the company, what are the key risks that the company is managing and what are the targets for those risks. And I think, one of the keys that I've seen with the utility that we helped up in the Northeast was the fact that they could tie their risk reduction back to that top-level risk register was one of the key points that helped them win the capital investment required. David, I don't know, I'm going to turn it over to you maybe for some points around the asset management side and how you've dealt with this from an aging infrastructure standpoint.
Yeah, I think the security has a lot of similarities with the same challenges transmission and distribution, and particularly distribution infrastructure, has had when it comes to actually getting the organization to turn the ship and look at investments in that infrastructure. Because whenever you're dealing with something that's individually not particularly significant, but collectively a major problem, it's what I'd call a chronic crisis that develops. And that's really only ever confronted when some other unlucky entity has a major issue occur, and then the entire industry changes its mind, pivots, and it becomes a major source of investment. And I think the whole security subject, I think we're in the cusp of it transitioning. But again, I come back to your previous point, Dave, about how do you help the leadership of the company accurately pinpoint where you want to make that investment and how it's going to directly affect the risks that the company has. Back to you.
All right, great. So the solution is to talk about security really in the context of a security risk framework. And there's a number of frameworks out there. One thing I've found in the security industry is there's no lack of industry standard frameworks that one can leverage. And I think the important point is, select the framework that makes sense for your organization and that, where you've got buy-in. This particular framework, which we used at the Northeast Utility, is really based on a Department of Homeland Security standard. And it basically says, from a security standpoint, you can think about three different dimensions of security, if you will. There's obviously physical, cyber, and then the human aspect. The way this framework sets up is, as a first step, you'd want to set security goals along those dimensions. In a risk-based company or a company with a risk culture, those sort of goals start at the very top. It's part of the, many times it's part of the charge of the board of directors to set, what their risk tolerance level is. And again, we've seen this in banking. We're just starting to see it emerge from thought leaders in the utility industry as well now. The second step in this framework is to identify the assets, systems, networks, and functions that are in play that where you want to manage the risk. That's all about inventory and assets, inventory and systems, and understanding the critical functionality within those systems. Third, it's all about assessing the risks, and this is really the heart of the activity around looking at, understanding, quantifying, and understanding the consequences of those risks. One of the lessons learned that we heard from our partner in the Northeast that we worked with is this is a great point to engage an external party like Black & Veatch. Assessing risks is something that can be done, I guess, without bias if it's an external party, and that's a real value add point in the process to engage an external party. Fourth step is prioritize. You assess the risks, and then you prioritize those risks based on impact and consequence. And then based on that prioritization, you pick off your top priority items and you implement protective programs, which is identifying where you're making investments. What are the corrective programs that you're implementing? And then the final step is measuring effectiveness and the measurements from that effectiveness feedback into the prior steps. So let's move on to the next slide. Here we talk about really, steps. The first step was setting targets in that framework. The second step is identifying asset systems, networks, and functions. The utility that we worked with in the Northeast went to a tier structure for their assets, and so they identified, the top tier items, high risk, compliance-related assets, Things in the power industry that are tied to NERC CIP would typically be in this tier. And so they took a look at all of the tiers of their assets and started a conversation really with their senior leadership around, these tiers, how we want to treat them, what the standards are for these tiers, what the risks are. And, as with any security program, I think the first step is always, it's a basic step of inventorying your assets. And one of the things I just find interesting when I'm working with utilities is a step of inventorying assets sometimes can be more challenging than one would think. So I want to stop here and maybe get David's perspective a little bit on the asset management component behind behind this step and why this basic step seems to be a challenge.
Yeah, thanks. Again, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that most of the systems in play today are all primarily related to running the systems on a day-to-day basis, or potentially in parallel generating work for people to go and perform maintenance and so forth. And to the degree there are any hierarchies and so on, they're all generally speaking physical hierarchies or network hierarchies. I think what's great about the point that Dave's making and the work that we already do in the asset management space is in exactly the same way as this slide depicts. In developing an approach and strategy for asset investments, essentially we go through the identical steps. And it's quite possible for those of you who are out there considering this that either you have colleagues or parts of the business that have already undertaken this from a physical asset management standpoint, or if they haven't, the opportunity is there for you to team up together, because essentially creating that physical and relationship understanding around criticality or risk is a common thing you have between the two groups. So again, back to you, Dave. I'd say that's a critical point for people to consider here.
Yep. The other point I'll make on this topic is sometimes I'll talk to customers and I'll hear executives say, we're compliant. What else do we need to do? I think that the key is focusing on more than just compliance is really important, an important aspect. If you think about the compliance world in power, which is NERC CIP focused, that compliance is focused on the stability of the grid as a whole. It's not focused on other areas that could obviously have adverse impact. And so I think one of the sort of education points, depending on where you are in the life cycle, is migrating to a risk-based organization. One of the education points is, you can't just focus on compliance. You have to focus beyond that. So just another point that I want to make. And again, I'm seeing a broad spectrum in the utility industry. Some, as I mentioned, are very, have the risk culture and are managing risks, and compliance is there, but most of them are going well beyond what's required from a compliance standpoint. And then I do see others where compliance is the focus, checking the box, ensuring that, there's no fine for non-compliance and those sorts of things, and doing the bare minimum. So you see quite a spectrum in the industry. So the next step in the framework is assessing the risks for each asset class. And this is really all about understanding what the vulnerabilities are for the asset class, what the threats are, and what the consequences are if a breach or asset failure occurs. The other aspect that's reviewed here is looking at what controls are in place to mitigate risks. There will always be controls in place. There are several industry standards that we use to come in and assess how those controls measure up against industry standard. And there's, as I mentioned, there's several standards. This one that we used at the utility in the Northeast happened to be based on the NIST 830 standard, and was an effective way for us to develop the set of potential risks and vulnerabilities and the controls and how effective they were. So in assessing risks, once you've identified sort of the inventory of potential vulnerabilities and the controls against those, you have to start to quantify the risks. And the first step in quantification is really assessing the likelihood of failure. What we do is we take all of the potential, what we call threat actors, and align them against all the potential vulnerabilities and assess the likelihood of that threat actor causing a breach or failure against that vulnerability. There's a number of vulnerabilities that you see here. There's all sorts of vulnerabilities around adversarial or intentional events, which we're seeing more and more of. The natural events like hurricanes and tornadoes, and then accidents and technological failures. And I think again, I'm gonna ask David maybe to talk a little bit about the fact that we're kind of doing the same sort of work in security as we are in sort of asset management and solving the aging infrastructure problem, and we're looking at the same threat actors in some cases. So David, maybe you want to say a few words about that.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. There's probably the only other dimension, obviously, we tend to focus on when we're specifically looking at the assets is the results of wear and tear. So clearly, when you're looking purely the asset utilization and degradation side of the house, that's primarily focused on the amount by which an asset's used, the throughput, the number of times it's actually triggered, if it's a switch, for example, and just its physical age. And that just becomes another dimension to this sort of spectrum that Dave has there on the deck. But essentially, in the end, the net result is the same, as we'll come to in the next thing where we talk about consequences. So essentially, we're going through very, very similar work, an underlying preparatory work in getting to this point. And I guess that's the whole theme of our conversation here. So back to you, Dave.
All right. So once we've quantified the likelihood of failure, the other dimension of quantification that we look at around risks is the consequence of those failures. And those consequences have there's a range of consequences. Some of these have financial impact. Some of these are other items that you can't tie directly to financials, like reputation, for example, but are highly important. We've seen as consequences of failures from a security standpoint in our industry is obviously typically outages, and we've seen examples, ranging from there was a significant hack in the Ukraine back in 2015. Causing an outage lasting, I think, up to about 6 hours. The interesting point is that same type of hack actually occurred in the Ukraine here less than just a couple of weeks ago. So, the threat is there. We're seeing it across different industries. We're seeing, there was a recent water utility in New York that was where we had Iranian hackers that took control of a water dam. There's other interesting angles that we're seeing. I mean, the types of consequences vary dramatically. There was another recent example where thousands of video cameras out on the edge of the grid were basically hacked with a denial of service type of hack. And each of these cameras was able to basically generate web traffic and direct it at one site and cause a denial of service issue. So, there's a wide range of consequences that we're seeing in the industry. And so I think it's probably everybody on this call recognizes the importance and that the threat is real. So the question is, how do we look at the financial impact of some of these consequences? One of the things that I've taken away recently is just the fact that because aging assets has been an issue for so long, the analysis around how you address aging infrastructure is more mature. And in fact, I've seen with David's team some excellent work out of on Black & Veatch around modeling the financial impacts of failures. And maybe, David, you can talk a little bit about that and how we might leverage that in the security world.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Actually, this is where the rubber meets the road, and it's a lot of hard work to do this, but it's invaluable when you come to the critical stage of representing the risk and then starting to tie investments directly to it. And you're quite right. And of particular relevance is the effort involved in analyzing the risk of your distribution assets and your high volume assets. ways of grouping them collectively, then modeling that information as it connects to and integrates with sources of your revenue data, such as your CIS systems, obviously usage. All those different data sources have to be drawn together into a common model through which you can then model those impacts very, very quickly once that hard work is done. So again, back to the theme of this conversation, either the opportunity is there to seek out that model that's already been done, or to seek out relationships with the teams who are responsible for asset management and work on a joint approach to this area. This is probably one of the more difficult exercises to complete.
Yep, thank you, David. So we've gone through a quantification exercise at this point of what's the likelihood of failure and the consequence of failure. And if you were able to sort of plot your assets in this matrix, you'd see a natural clustering of assets that would catch your eye at the upper right, which is the areas that are both high likelihood of failure and high consequence. These are, typically the natural areas where you will focus. You'll want to focus your capital investment. And, again, it's all about getting to quantified risk, understanding that risk in the context of the assets in the organization, and being able to articulate, where you are from a risk standpoint is really one of just the key outcomes of this process. Now, once you've quantified your risk, the next logical steps, is to say, okay, here I am, I'm up in the upper right quadrant. Where do I really aspire to be? And, your aspirations as an organization could be, bottom left. You've probably got in place, controls that take you from a pure risk standpoint down to some level of residual risk. The question becomes, in the conversation that you have with your executive team, and this is what played out at this Northeast utility we worked with, is that residual risk acceptable or not? If it's not acceptable, then you get into conversation about what the gap is, and then you start getting into understanding what that capital investment is required to get you from that midpoint down to the target level. This is where the rubber meets the road, and I think there's obviously science behind getting to fact-based data and risk, but there's also you've got to have a very good almost sales mentality within your organization around how you articulate what the risks are. It has to be real to your executive team, and that's it's challenging. And I think we've learned some terrific lessons from the utility we worked with in the Northeast around how to do this. Back to the points I made earlier. It's getting approval for large capital investments. You have to engage at a board level. You have to tie to the corporate risk register. And you have to make the conversation real, and you have to talk about financials and talk about what's at risk from a financial standpoint. So once you understand where you are on that risk spectrum, and you've got an understanding of how that lays out against the company's targets. Then you move into an activity of actually identifying and prioritizing what the capital investments need to be. And I think once you identify what needs capital investment, those needs will likely outstrip other parameters that are in the organization. And so you have to balance against things like what is my capital budget. What are the staffing resources to implement these improvements? All of those constraints need to be factored into basically the capital planning process. And I think we've been talking about this theme of how solving for aging infrastructure in the asset management world is already driving significant investment. I think it's a natural point to say, how do we leverage that investment that's ongoing today and piggyback the security aspect of it onto that. So David, maybe you could say a few words about just investment, capital investment in general.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. As many of you probably know, particularly here in the States, it's been going on for some time in the UK. There are increasingly opportunities for utilities to put together cases for major tranches of investment based on some mathematical or structured plan for reducing risk. Various states have provided either regulatory riders or the ability to obtain rate relief for investments for that purpose. And again, the opportunity is clearly there, where all investments is always relative. And as a case in point, I've worked with a different company where we, in the process of justifying several $1 billion worth of asset infrastructure improvements, the incremental cost of, in parallel, investing in upgraded technology infrastructure to help manage those assets and maintain them was really seen in a completely different context as part of an overall investment, and therefore it gave extra strength to what would normally have been a quite challenging case to make, you know, when it comes to just investing in core systems. I think security has an even bigger compelling argument to make, and again, part of the counsel we would put forward, and clearly Dave and I, this is a sort of approach we're taking, is wherever possible, where physical infrastructure is being evaluated for improvement, we encourage our clients to look at all the other corollary opportunities to include other investments that, you know, set against the major investment in the capital. It becomes a more incremental discussion versus a hotly contested topic. So back to you, Dave.
Yep, great point, David. Really relevant point. So at the end of the day, you know, like every other investment, you need to know that you're making progress. And so when we talk about looking at where we are from a risk standpoint against target, it can't be just a one-time event. We have to continually take checkpoints on how our risk is trending versus our investment. And you know, this chart depicts the fact that as you're laying out the capital investment, you ought to see impact around that risk reduction. And you know, again, these seem like basic and trivial concepts. It all starts, I think, with getting to a risk-based culture in the company. And as I said, you know, you see a wide spectrum of that, but starting to have the conversation focused around risk, I think, is really the key, and ensuring that you have some mechanism for capturing that risk and trending it over time as you're making those investments to prove to your executive team that you're getting bang for the buck. Even if it's not increased revenue or reduced cost, you're getting the anticipated outcome. And so that proof has to be there through measurement. So to summarize, you know, I think it's, you know, the concepts are simply understand the system that you want to look at around risk, identify those critical assets, know the interdependencies, identify what the vulnerabilities are in those systems, quantify the risk, what's the likelihood of failure, what's the consequence of failure, and then look at, you know, how does that quantification lay out against what the target risk levels would be. Identify what the improvements are, start those corrective programs to improve and reduce those risk levels to align them with targets. Quantify the benefits, and quantify them, and again, I'm talking about risk reduction, high risk asset mitigation. And then, you know, demonstrate value. I mean, I think you know, all of this ties back to the fact that executives need justification around the investments that they're making. In fact, the ratepayers, you know, demand it in the utility industry. And so this is kind of the key point, is making sure you're demonstrating value. I think many times from an executive standpoint, they view security as a black hole that will take as much money as they're willing to put into it. And you know, I think the hard reality is you can never get down to you can never completely eliminate risk. And so it's just a matter of what is your risk tolerance, and making sure that you're investing to get to that risk tolerance. It will not be zero. Your risk tolerance can't be zero unless you happen to have infinitely deep pockets. And then the last point I'll let David close with. David, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Obviously, it's been an underlying theme to our entire conversation here, but clearly, and I think increasingly in the future, the intersection between the physical distributed assets, the way they're managed, the way they're operated, and how they're secured is probably going to be the hot topic of the next decade. So we obviously would encourage everybody out there, particularly those of you charged with these areas, be it the asset management side of the business or the security side, to seek ways to come together, create common understandings of the model, of the assets, of consequences, and so on, and really develop these things either in parallel or even ideally as an integrated way of looking at the universe. And I truly believe, particularly around security, this will enable people to give leadership more concrete ways of viewing why investment's so critical in both cyber and physical security, how that can tie back to the investments they're making in all of these major asset infrastructures, and hopefully give you a much better chance of getting the attention and, more importantly, the funding that you need to get some of this work completed. So that's pretty much it from me, and I'll hand back to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'd really like to start with a broad question here, and that points to an earlier slide when you talked about reputational risk. Let's assume for a second Ashtabula Power and Light, fictitious utility in Ohio, is totally brought down by a cyber attack so that their ability to serve their customers is severely limited for a week or two. That would be a bet the company kind of event. Would it not, in terms of risk, wouldn't there be severe risk that ownership and control of that company might be threatened?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it highlights the fact that the types of priorities that are given to assets in a utility that can have that dramatic an impact are, first of all, they're top of mind from a government agency standpoint in the compliance regulation. They're also top of mind naturally for the utility itself. And so, yeah, I think it's, you hit on a point that this infrastructure cannot be, replaced on a dime. We don't have, there's not spare transmission transformers, waiting to just be plugged in on a whim should an entire substation be taken out. So absolutely, those are the types of assets that the most protections are given, whether it's video surveillance or physical barriers and those sorts of things. I don't know if I got to the heart of that question, but those are the types of doomsday scenarios that I think we all work to protect the grid and make sure that they don't play out.
Now, both of you have backgrounds in other industries as well as energy. When it comes to both quantifying risk and justifying investments in a very sophisticated, proportional manner, how do utilities stack up to other sectors, and what lessons can they learn from other sectors?
Yeah, this is a big topic with me just because I came from banking, and banking has been so risk averse for so many years, it's one of those things where it sort of slaps you in the face when you jump from that industry to utilities, and you realize utilities are on a journey, and they're in the very infancy of it, of starting to think about risk and manage risk and have that culture. Banking, you would see very large risk organizations in banking focused on just ensuring that all the types of risks you could enumerate are managed effectively, whether it's operational, financial, any number of different types of risk, credit, Utilities, there's some utilities that really just aren't yet thinking this way. They're starting to turn that way, and I actually wrote an article recently on, what utilities can learn from banking. There's a lot. The journey's already been taken by other industries, and I think it's instructive for utilities to look at, how other industries like banking, for example, use risk management and incorporate some of those best practices.
We're getting a handful of questions in from the audience. I encourage you, if you have questions, submit them now. I'm going to turn to them shortly, but one last question for our two panelists here. I was talking to a Cal ISO executive just yesterday, and he was talking about utilities as they seek out new business models in the era of flat to declining sales. They have an opportunity to figure out how to value resiliency in new ways for customers. And it's kind of on the edges of what you're talking about justifying utility security investments. But how would what you're talking about here play into new business model approaches that utilities could more broadly embrace?
I don't know, David, you want to field that one, or?
Yeah. So are you explicitly talking about at the market level there, Marty, the ISO level, or down at the individual business level?
Well, I'm talking about the individual business level around the country. As utilities work internally to justify investments, they also want to monetize these investments. And might there be new ways?
Right. Yes, absolutely. And the way one can start looking at this is in terms of if you start to look at your relationship, particularly with your industrial or commercial mid-market customers. I say that because some of the major industrial firms usually take their own independent steps to secure their energy supply and their own risk management. But in terms of moving more towards a quality of service model that's based on the resiliency of the service you provide, especially in this era where we're seeing an increasing deployment of distributed generation, micro, and even I guess the new buzzword is nano generation. Weaving those things together along with either physical or cybersecurity all packaged together is clearly a potential direction people can take, because I think the current trend towards distributed generation, as usual, is probably going to outstrip the industry's ability to secure it and support it. So I think for utility companies, there's definitely opportunities to think about getting ahead of that and being the logical partner that these firms can work with in implementing some of these new technologies, managing them and securing them. So I hope that sort of goes some way to address your question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Here's a question from a listener. How should companies differentiate investment in security for their corporate network versus their control or operation networks? Would this be part of the threat and vulnerability analysis by asset class?
Yeah, absolutely it would. There's very different types of risks associated with both. Whether you're if you're talking about the network that's controlling the actual grid, those typically take a higher priority. But there's also substantial risks in just the enterprise applications that need to be managed. I mean, for example, your CIS billing systems probably got things like credit card numbers, and it's those sort of vulnerabilities have to be looked at as a risk as well. And it comes down to priorities. If you've got limited capital investment, you have to weigh the risk scores of two very different, an operational type of risk versus more of I'll say a back office breach type of risk. Those, how do those scores shake out and compare, and how are they valued by the company's executive team? But risk is risk, whether, and so this is how you try to get to a scoring system that quantifies it, whether you're, regardless of what part of the company you're talking about.
Okay. Here's a question. Besides from costs associated with assessing risk and development plans and procedures, what are the leading costs driving technologies that help to detect and assess threats? What are the range of ideal perimeter intrusion technologies for utilities?
Yeah, there's a wide range of technologies that are being invested in, and what we see, the example of our customer in the Northeast, they are building out and investing heavily in telecommunication for increased bandwidth for video surveillance, and their video surveillance is really second to none, and they've recognized that in order to have what they need to invest in bandwidth. So we're also seeing investments in perimeters that start to become, very high grade. You talk about bulletproof physical barriers in some cases for probably your highest valued assets. We're starting to see utilities, build perimeters that in some cases you might see around embassies and the military grade type of perimeter. So there's a broad range. We're not seeing that extreme across the entire industry, but we're seeing spots in the industry where people are making those types of investments. So yeah, I'm not sure if I got at the heart of that question, but back to you, Marty.
Okay. Another questioner asks, what are your views regarding government-mandated security measures justified by the impact of threats and vulnerabilities to the public good?
Yeah, obviously the government is heavily involved in topics of security around the stability of the grid as a whole, and I think all of those mandates obviously are very important. I think utilities really need to, they need to take those mandates as obviously the most serious and take those as the highest priority, and they need to go beyond that. They need to go beyond what the government mandates. I think that would be the stance, and that's the stance you see in the industry. I mean, security is kind of an interesting conversion of or collusion of government, academia, industry. There's a lot of hands in the pot trying to solve the security problem, and it's kind of an interesting mix of entities. Government plays a very dominant role, and as it should, for the safety and public safety and welfare of the grid as a whole.
Yeah, Dave,
go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to add to that the only additional point I would make is that particularly in this area, like all things technological, is that whatever those things may be, they should be sufficiently, I wouldn't say flexible, but clear in terms of the requirement versus the solution. Because with the way the technology is evolving, both physical and cyber and so on, I think it would be important that whatever these mandates are, that they don't structure themselves in a way that would sort of forestall or hinder what is inevitably going to be a very, very rapidly developing space.
Mm-hmm. Kind of related to the last question, one listener asks, what technologies trends are you seeing being driven by NERC CIP 14 standards?
Well, NERC CIP 14 is, if I recall my NERC CIP numbers correctly, is the physical standard. And, I think this is where, this is Black and Veatch's strength is physical security. So we see a wide range of physical security. We see some utilities actually exceeding the NERC CIP requirement substantially. But generally speaking, that physical security is being recognized as almost an equally important topic around security as cyber. If you can't gain access physically, or maybe conversely, the right way to say is if you can gain access physically, you're likely to be able to hack the cyber side. So physical is a very important aspect of NERC CIP, as it should be.
We have one questioner asking about the value of human control versus automation. Here's his question. What are your thoughts on the changing technological environment and assets becoming more automated and interconnected? What are your thoughts on creating manual systems for critical infrastructure to improve response and recovery?
You know, it's kind of an interesting question. We've got all of this automation and interconnectivity, which is driving huge efficiency. Yeah, at the same time, when we start talking about security, we start trying to figure out ways to dismantle that interconnectivity so that, for example, your operational systems, can't be accessed through the IT side of your organization. So we start looking at how do we firewall those types of things. So it's an interesting dichotomy because on the one hand, we gain efficiencies from all of this automation and connectivity. On the other hand, we have to, as we just talked about, we have to make huge security investments to protect those efficiencies in the way we operate. And so I think that's an intriguing question to say, does it make sense to actually take a step back in some cases and look at, is it more cost effective to go manual as opposed to automated? I don't know. It's a very interesting question, something that I've done some thinking on recently.
We have one listener would like to go back to slide 13 if we could for a second. He asks, can you unpack the run to failure risk profile line in the graph on slide 13? Was that tied to the evaluation of consequences?
Thank you. Maybe David, that's a question for you. The run to failure question is more of a aging life cycle question generally.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they mean by unpack, but and obviously we can follow up with whoever the questioner was, but essentially that was just a way of projecting the current behavior, predicting the outcome of the current behavior drawn into the future. So essentially the elevating risk based on the collective set of assets being evaluated and the potential consequences and so forth, all put together in terms of potential dollar spend required as you look forward if you were not to change any behavior or to take any corrective action. That's essentially what this is trying to depict. We'd be happy to sort of circle back with the questioner offline if there was some more clarification.
Okay, for our last question, I'd like to ask both gentlemen to kind of lean back in your chairs and get philosophical for a minute. I did a cybersecurity webcast with some top government officials in response to Ted Koppel's book that caused quite a stir about a year ago called Lights Out, in which he posits it's inevitable that there's going to be a massive, debilitating grid takedown sometime in the near future. What do you think the likelihood of that scenario is, and how will it change the industry as we know it?
Oh boy, yeah, I think this is the reason. The reason you see the federal government so involved is the pure physical fact that in the power industry you can take out, I don't know what the exact number is, a dozen strategic physical sites, and if those dozen sites were targeted, whether through terrorist activity or other malicious activity, the grid could essentially be brought down for a significant period of time. So it's possible. Anything's possible, and with the climate we're in and the environment we're in, it's I don't know that I would go as far as to say it's inevitable. It's a constant tug of war between the nefarious actors and those trying to stop them, and whether something catastrophic occurs to the scale that Ted Koppel predicts, I'm not sure I'm willing to weigh in other than to say anything's possible, and it's an ongoing battle. And I'm not very philosophical. I'll turn it over to my more philosophical friend, David Price. So.
Yeah, actually, in my opinion, actually, a sizable part of our industry is actually designed to respond to catastrophic events. This industry is used to bringing the electric grid back online when there's a massive hurricane and so on and so forth. I obviously it may happen. I think what might be more worrying and of greater concern around this, if we think of security, I believe would be the more insidious activities of maybe corrupting code that controls systems, but not necessarily to bring the whole thing down, or maybe cause abnormal behavior that could potentially result in financial issues. So take breaking into a clearinghouse for an ISO grid and tinkering with the pricing calculations and so on, designed to cause upheaval and chaos. If someone was looking to be more nefarious, I'd be more concerned about the more insidious approaches. I believe our industry collectively has various things in place designed to respond to a major denial of service. Whether it does or doesn't happen, I think we're less prepared for the more targeted and insidious type of attack in the future.
With that, thank you both. Before we sign off, I'd like to thank our presenters and our sponsors, Black & Veatch. In the toolbar, click on the green icon to download the presentation and click through to the self-assessment. I'd like to tell you that the webcast will be available on demand on the Energy Times website for the next 48 hours, within the next 48 hours, and available for the next year. So if you have colleagues that want to listen to this for the first time, or if you yourself would like to re-listen, feel free to come back. Thank you so much for attending, and have a wonderful day.